Yiddish, guilty as charged, 60 days in county jail. The judge's gavel slammed down, his voice icy as he sentenced the man before him. The man didn't flinch. He had nothing left to lose. Judge Paul Bennett thought he was upholding justice in his small Kentucky courtroom until a group of Marines showed up, and everything changed. Who was this man? What brought the Marines there? What's the greatest act of compassion you've seen change a life? Let's find out. Welcome to True Quiet Stories. Let's uncover what happened in this story. If you love these stories, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing. In a small Kentucky town, the air smells of coal dust and justice. Judge Paul Bennett presided there. He was 55 years old. He worked as a district judge in the Harlan County Courthouse, a weathered building on Main Street that echoed with the weight of the law. Paul's days were methodical. He reviewed cases, heard testimonies, and issued rulings, his hands steady from years on the bench. He nodded at attorneys, even when the docket overflowed, even when the stories blurred together, even when the weight of his own decisions felt too heavy to bear. His thinning gray hair was always neatly parted, his black robe pristine and commanding, his eyes sharp but distant, a distance that came from a heart that had known order, that had known rules, that had known authority, a heart that judged more than it felt, even when the town demanded more, even when the cases whispered mercy, even when the years seemed to take more than they offered. Paul lived alone in a modest house on Elm Street, a quiet space with a leather recliner, a stack of legal books, and a window that overlooked the town square. The hum of crickets, a constant reminder of the things he couldn't escape, of the things he couldn't change, of the things he couldn't feel. His daughter, who'd once been his pride, had moved to Louisville 5 years ago after a falling out over his rigid ways, leaving Paul to face the courtroom alone, to keep his rulings, firm alone, to hold onto his principles alone, even in the silence, even in the dusk, even in the years that had passed since she left. Paul kept going. He worked hard. But he had a stern heart. He judged more than he listened. It was all he knew. Paul's life in Harlan, Kentucky, was a daily march through duty and the past. The town had seen better days, its streets lined with faded storefronts, its coal mines struggling through layoffs, its people worn by years of hard work, years of dreams deferred, years of a life that seemed to take more than it gave. Harlan was a small community, just over 1,800 people, a place where everyone knew everyone, where the Harlan County Courthouse had been a fixture for over a century, a building where locals sought justice, shared grievances, and found resolution, a place that Paul's grandfather had served as a clerk, that Paul had risen to judge, that Paul fought to keep impartial, even when the odds were against him, even when the cases grew heavy, even when the town seemed to forget the courthouse, to forget his family, to forget him. He grew up in Harlan, in a small house on Cedar Road, where his parents had raised him with discipline, with structure, with the belief that justice was the greatest gift you could give, that order was the greatest thing you could hold, that the law was the greatest thing you could serve, even when the world was harsh, even when the nights were long, even when the lessons were heavy. His father, Walter, had been a coal miner turned clerk, his hands rough as he filed papers, his voice firm as he taught Paul right from wrong, his pride a bright spot in their small home. A pride that Paul still felt even now, years after he was gone, years after a mining accident took him, years after the bench became his burden, his duty, his life. His mother, Evelyn, had been a seamstress, her smile a comfort to every neighbor, her hands quick as she stitched clothes, her faith a steady anchor for their family, her prayers a nightly ritual that Paul still remembered, even now, years after. She was gone years after pneumonia took her, years after the bench became his responsibility, his legacy, his purpose. They didn't have much money, their meals simple but hearty, stew on Sundays, cornbread on weekdays, a rare treat of pie when the budget allowed. But they had each other, and that made their small house a fortress, a place where Paul always felt secure, always felt guided, always felt driven. Those memories were all Paul had left after his daughter left. A bitter falling out that came after a heated argument over his unyielding nature, her laughter silenced, her presence gone. Oh, void he couldn't fill. They'd been close once, partners in every family tradition, allies through every storm, and their rift on that rainy spring evening shattered the bond they'd built, leaving Paul with nothing but the courthouse, the house, the silence that filled his days, his nights, his heart. He'd been 50 then, his hands still steady, his principles still firm, but his world forever changed, his heart heavy with regret, with solitude, with a life that seemed to demand more than he could give, more than he could bear, more than he could hold. He threw himself into his work, judging from morning to evening, his hand steady as he signed orders, his voice firm as he issued verdicts, his heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of duty, with the weight of a courtroom that was always demanding, a courtroom that hadn't seen mercy in years, a courtroom that reminded him of everything he'd lost, everything he couldn't afford, everything he couldn't feel, even in the silence, even in the dusk, even in the years that had kept him apart. But Paul had a stern heart, a heart that still beat with the lessons his parents taught him, with the structure they'd instilled, with the authority he held above all else, a sternness that lived on in the rulings he issued, even now, even here, even in the courtroom where no one saw him, where no one cared, where no one knew. He worked with precision, taking pride in the law he upheld, making sure every case was handled, every ruling was just, every sentence was firm, a strict standard for the people who filled his days, even if they never understood, even if they never thanked him, even if they never saw the effort he put in, the duty he poured into every verdict, the rigidity he gave to every decision. The Harlan County Courthouse was steeped in a heavy silence that chilly November morning, the air thick with the scent of old wood and the tension of a verdict delivered. Judge Paul Bennett sat high on his bench, his gavel's echo still lingering. In the room, his eyes fixed on the man before him with a cold, unyielding stare that spoke of years of rigid justice. The courtroom was nearly empty, a few onlookers scattered across the worn wooden benches, their whispers barely audible over the creak of the floorboards, their faces a mix of curiosity and indifference. Paul adjusted his robe, his hands steady. Despite the flicker of routine in his chest, a flicker he ignored, a flicker that reminded him of the mercy he'd long buried, a flicker that he couldn't afford, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the moments that passed him by. He looked down at the defendant, a man whose name he'd only glanced at in the file, a man whose plea he'd dismissed as irrelevant, a man whose story he didn't care to hear, a story he understood as guilt, a story he felt as routine, a story he couldn't ignore. He didn't know the man's past, didn't know his pain, didn't know the weight he carried, but he knew the law, the look of a thief, the need for order, even if it meant judgment, even if it meant harshness, even if it meant overlooking the man's quiet despair. The man's name was James Carter, though Paul didn't dwell on it, didn't know the story behind those hollow eyes, didn't know the weight he carried, the weight of a war that had taken everything, the weight of a life that had left him with nothing, the weight of a silence that had become his only companion, his only comfort, his only truth. James was 65 years old, a homeless veteran who'd been surviving on the streets of Harlan for years, a man who'd served as a corporal in the U.S. Marine Corps, who'd fought in the Gulf War in 1991, who'd seen things he couldn't unsee, who'd done things he couldn't undo, who'd lost things he couldn't reclaim. He'd been a hero once, a man who'd saved his platoon during a fierce firefight in Kuwait, shielding his squad from an enemy grenade, his own body torn by shrapnel, his own heart scarred by the screams of the men he couldn't save, by the faces of the friends he'd lost, by the guilt that had followed him home, that had followed him through the years, that had followed him to the courtroom where he now stood, where he now trembled, where he now survived, on the edges of a town that had forgotten him, on the edges of a world that had moved on without him, on the edges of a life that had left him with nothing but the clothes on his back, a tattered dog tag around his neck, the memories in his mind, the silence in his heart. James had lost everything. After the war, his family, his home, his health, his very sense of self, the war a thief that had taken more than he could ever hope to reclaim. He'd come home to Harlan in 1993, a different man than the one who'd left. His body weakened by injuries, his smile gone, his heart heavier with the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, the things he couldn't undo. His wife, Margaret, had tried to help, her gentle hands a comfort, her soft voice a lifeline, her love a beacon in the darkness that had consumed him, that had changed him, that had broken him in ways she couldn't fix, in ways he couldn't share, in ways they couldn't survive. But the PTSD was too much, the flashbacks too real, the guilt too heavy, the trauma too strong, a force that pulled him under, that pulled him away, that pulled him apart, until Margaret couldn't hold on anymore, until she passed away from a sudden illness in 2000, leaving James alone with their daughter, Sarah, a daughter who grew up and moved to Lexington, seeking a life far from the shadow of a father who couldn't find his way back, who couldn't find his peace, who couldn't find his home. James didn't blame her, didn't fight her, didn't beg her to stay, knowing she was right, knowing he was broken, knowing he couldn't be the father Sarah deserved, the man he'd once been, the man he'd never be again. James had been arrested for stealing a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter from the local market. A desperate act to survive another day, a meal that held the promise of sustenance, a meal that held the weight of his hunger, a meal that held the shame of his fall, even in the silence, even in the cold, even in the years that had kept him apart. He lived in a makeshift shelter behind the town's old rail yard, a crumbling shack with a tarp roof, a tattered blanket his only warmth, a cracked flashlight his only light, a small tin box his only possession, a box that held the things that mattered most to him, the things that kept him going, the things that reminded him of the man he'd been, even if he couldn't feel it anymore, even if he couldn't find it anymore, even if he couldn't live it anymore. Inside the box was a faded photo of Margaret and Sarah, taken on Sarah's 8th birthday, their smiles bright against a sunny park backdrop, a moment of joy frozen in time, a moment James held on to, a moment that broke his heart, that kept him alive, that kept him hoping, even if he didn't know why, even if he didn't know how, even if he didn't know what for. There was also a letter Margaret wrote him during the war, the paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still legible, words of love and hope that had kept him going through the darkest nights, words he read when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear. And there was his Bronze Star, a medal he'd been awarded for his bravery in the Gulf War, a medal he'd buried in the box, a medal he couldn't look at, a medal that felt like a mockery of the pain he carried, of the lives he couldn't save, of the man he'd once been, a man he'd lost, a man he'd never be again. James didn't fight the sentence that day, didn't plead, didn't let Paul see the depth of his despair, even though he had no money for the fine, even though jail meant another cold night, even though his voice was too weak to speak, a weakness he understood, a weakness he felt, a weakness he couldn't hide. He stood there, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the table, his eyes downcast with shame, his heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of survival, with the weight of a life that had been reduced to this, even if he didn't expect mercy, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know what would come of it. The Harlan County Courthouse felt colder than ever that gray November morning, the air heavy with the weight of a sentence delivered without mercy. James Carter stood before the bench, his frail frame trembling under the burden of Judge Paul. Bennett's ruling, his hands gripping the edge of the table for support, as if the worn wood could anchor him against the storm of despair that threatened to sweep him away. The courtroom was a quiet expanse, The few onlookers scattered across the wooden benches holding their breath, their eyes fixed on the man in tattered clothes, a man whose shame was written in the slump of his shoulders, a man whose story they didn't know, a story Paul had refused to hear, a story that seemed destined to end in 60 days of confinement. Paul adjusted his glasses, his movements mechanical, as he prepared to call the next case, his mind already shifting to the docket, his heart unmoved by the man he'd just sentenced, a man he saw as a thief, a man he judged without knowing, a man whose quiet suffering he dismissed with the slam of his gavel, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the moments that passed him by. James didn't look up, didn't speak, didn't let Paul see the depth of his despair. Even though the sentence meant 60 days in a cell, he knew his body couldn't endure, even though he had no money to pay a fine, even though his bones ached. With the chill of a life on the streets, a chill he understood, a chill he felt, a chill he couldn't escape, he stood there, a broken man, his eyes fixed on the scuffed floor, his heart heavy with the weight of loss, with the weight of survival, with the weight of a life that had been reduced to this moment, even if he didn't expect mercy, even if he didn't believe he deserved it, even if he didn't know what would come of it. But James's story hadn't gone unseen, not by everyone, not by those who saw beyond the tattered clothes and the courtroom file, not by those who knew the weight of a past unspoken, the power of a heroism unseen, the value of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. In the back of the courtroom sat a man who'd been watching with growing unease, a man who'd seen more than most, a man whose own life had been shaped by the kind of sacrifice James embodied, a man whose heart stirred with a recognition that went deeper than the law could ever reach. His name was Stephen Hayes, a 58-year-old lawyer and a retired Marine, a man who'd served in the Gulf War alongside men like James, who'd known heroes who'd faded into the shadows, who'd carried the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that James bore, a silence Stephen recognized, a silence he understood, a silence he couldn't ignore. Stephen had been in the courtroom that day on a different case, his hands resting on a briefcase filled with legal briefs, his eyes catching the quiet man at the front, the way James's hands trembled as he stood, the way his dog tag glinted faintly under the courtroom lights, the way the moment held a weight Stephen couldn't ignore, a weight that spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of a hero forgotten, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the years that had kept him apart. He'd approached James after the initial hearing, his voice steady but warm as he asked about the dog tag, about the war, about the life James had lived, about the pain he'd carried, even if James's words were few, even if he'd given up hope, even if he'd never expected anyone to care, even in the silence, even in the courtroom, even in the years that had kept him apart. Stephen didn't stop there, couldn't stop there, wouldn't stop there. Knowing James's story deserved more, knowing his sacrifice deserved more, knowing a hero deserved more than a cold sentence in a forgotten courtroom, even in the silence, even in the law, even in the years that had kept him apart. He drove to the local Marine recruiting office that evening, his heart heavy with the weight of what he'd learned, with the weight of what he knew he had to do, with the weight of a story that deserved to be told, a story that deserved to be heard, a story that deserved to be honored, even if no one else saw, even if no one else cared, even if the world kept moving on without them. The office was a small brick building near the town square, its walls lined with posters of Marines in uniform, its desk cluttered with recruitment pamphlets, its atmosphere charged with the quiet pride of service. Stephen called his former commanding officer, Colonel Laura Mitchell, a woman who'd served with James, who'd known Marines like him, who'd seen the toll war took on those who fought it, who'd lived with the same guilt, the same pain, the same silence that James carried, a silence Laura recognized, a silence she understood, a silence she couldn't ignore. Stephen told her everything, his voice steady as he spoke of James's Bronze Star, of the platoon he'd saved in the Gulf War, of the life that had crumbled after, of the man who stood in a courtroom with nothing left but his memories. Even in the silence, even in the dusk, even in the years that had kept them apart. Laura listened, her own heart stirring with the weight of a brother Marine's story, a story she'd heard echoes of in her own life, a story she knew needed to be honored, a story she couldn't let fade into the shadows of a small-town courthouse. On a somber Tuesday morning, the sound of boots echoed through the Harlan County Courthouse, a steady rhythm that broke the stillness of the room, that stopped Paul in his tracks as he prepared to call the next case, that made his heart pound with unease and curiosity, a sound that spoke of something big, something unexpected, a sound that would change everything forever. For Paul, for James, for the town of Harlan, for the world that would hear their story, that would see their honor, that would remember their sacrifice, their redemption, their humanity, in a way that would last, in a way that would matter, in a way that would echo louder than words, louder than silence, louder than the law that had kept them apart. The courtroom door swung open, and the onlookers turned, their whispers falling silent as a group of U.S. Marines in dress uniforms entered, their faces set with purpose, their movements deliberate, their presence a testament to a brotherhood that spanned decades, a brotherhood that had come to right a wrong, a brotherhood that had come for one of their own, even in the silence, even in the courtroom, even in the years that had kept them apart. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to True Quiet Stories for more untold tales of valor. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.